The church stood at the edge of the town, its steeple piercing the night sky like a needle threading through black fabric. I had been working as a guard there for a few months, mostly to earn some extra money. The job was simple: patrol the grounds, make sure no one vandalized the property, and keep an eye out for anything unusual. Unusual, of course, was a relative term. Churches were supposed to be peaceful, sacred places, but this one had an air of unease that I couldn't quite shake. Maybe it was the way the wind howled through the trees, or the way the moonlight cast long, jagged shadows across the gravestones. Or maybe it was just my imagination. One night, as I was making my rounds, I noticed something strange. The air felt heavier, denser, as if the atmosphere itself had shifted. I paused near the old oak tree that stood just outside the church doors. Its branches twisted and turned like skeletal fingers, and for a moment, I thought I saw something move in the darkness. I shook my head, telling myself it was just the wind. But then I heard it, a faint whisper, so soft it was almost inaudible. It sounded like someone was calling my name. I turned around, my flashlight cutting through the darkness. At first, I saw nothing. Then, slowly, a figure emerged from the shadows. It was an old woman, her face pale and wrinkled, her eyes sunken and hollow. She wore a tattered black dress that fluttered in the breeze, and her hair was a wild tangle of gray strands. She looked like she had stepped out of a nightmare. I froze, my grip tightening on the flashlight. "Who are you?" I asked, my voice trembling. "What are you doing here?" The old woman smiled, but it wasn't a kind smile. It was cold, calculating, as if she knew something I didn't. "I've been waiting for you," she said, her voice like the rustling of dead leaves. "You have a choice to make, young one, a choice that will change your life forever." I took a step back, my mind racing. This couldn't be real. It had to be some kind of prank, or maybe I was just tired and seeing things. But the woman's presence was undeniable. She was real, and she was standing right in front of me. "What are you talking about?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. "What choice?" The old woman's smile widened, revealing a row of yellowed, crooked teeth. "Join us," she said, her voice low and hypnotic. "Join our cult, and you will gain power beyond your wildest dreams. You will no longer be a mere guard, patrolling these empty grounds. You will be a master of the dark arts, a wielder of forbidden knowledge." I felt a chill run down my spine. A cult? Black magic? This had to be some kind of joke. But the woman's eyes bore into mine, and I couldn't look away. There was something in her gaze, something ancient and malevolent, that made me believe every word she said. I don't know," I stammered, my mind a whirlwind of fear and confusion. "I don't think I want that." The old woman's smile faded, replaced by a look of cold indifference. "Very well," she said, "but remember you had your chance, and chances like this don't come often." With that, she turned and walked away, her figure dissolving into the darkness as if she had never been there at all. I stood there for a long time, my heart racing, my mind replaying the encounter over and over again. Was it real? Had I just been offered a place in a black magic cult? And more importantly, what would have happened if I had said yes? I never saw the old woman again, but I couldn't shake the feeling that she was still out there, watching, waiting. I quit my job as a guard soon after that night, unable to shake the unease that had settled deep in my bones. The church still stands at the edge of town, its steeple piercing the night sky, but I'll never look at it the same way again. It was a quiet evening, the kind of evening where the world seems to hold its breath. My wife and I had decided to visit the church to offer our prayers. We weren't particularly religious, but life had been stressful lately, and we thought a little spiritual guidance might help. The church was an old, imposing structure, its stone walls weathered by time, and its stained glass windows glowing faintly in the fading light. It was beautiful in a haunting sort of way. As we walked through the front doors, I couldn't help but feel a sense of unease. The air inside was cool and still, and the faint scent of incense lingered in the air. We lit a few candles and knelt down to pray, the flickering flames casting long shadows on the walls. Everything seemed normal, peaceful even. But then, as we were leaving, my wife stopped suddenly, her eyes fixed on something outside. "Do you see that?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. I followed her gaze to the graveyard behind the church. At first I didn't see anything unusual. The graveyard was old, with moss-covered headstones and gnarled trees that twisted toward the sky. But then I saw it, a faint, flickering light, like a candle flame, coming from one of the graves. "What is that?" I asked, my voice tinged with unease. "I don't know," my wife replied, her eyes wide with curiosity. "Let's go see." I hesitated. Graveyards at night weren't exactly my idea of a good time, but my wife was already walking toward the light, her steps quick and determined. I had no choice but to follow. As we approached the grave, the light grew brighter, casting an eerie glow over the surrounding area. The headstone was old and weathered, the name on it barely legible. My wife knelt down in front of it, her eyes fixed on the light. I stood behind her, my unease growing with every passing second. "Do you feel that?" she asked, her voice trembling. "Feel what?" I replied, though I already knew what she meant. The air around us felt charged, electric, as if something was about to happen. Before I could say anything else, my wife reached out and touched the light. The moment her fingers made contact, she froze, her body going rigid. I called out to her, but she didn't respond. Her eyes were wide, unblinking, and her face was pale, almost ghostly. "Hey, are you okay?" I asked, my voice rising in panic. Still, she didn't respond. I reached out to shake her, but before I could, she turned to look at me, and I knew immediately that something went wrong. Her eyes were no longer her own. They were dark, empty, filled with a malevolence that made my blood run cold. "You shouldn't have come here," she said, her voice low and guttural, unlike her own. I stumbled back, my mind racing. What was happening? Was she possessed? The thought seemed ridiculous, but there was no other explanation. My wife, or whatever was controlling her, stood up slowly, her movements jerky and unnatural. She took a step toward me, and I took a step back, my heart pounding. "Stay back," I shouted, though I knew it was futile. She lunged at me, her hands clawing at the air. I managed to dodge her, but just barely. She came at me again, her movements faster, more aggressive. I didn't know what to do. I couldn't hurt her, but I couldn't let her hurt me either. In a desperate move, I grabbed one of the candles we had lit earlier and held it out in front of me. "Leave her alone," I shouted, my voice shaking. For a moment she hesitated, her eyes flickering toward the flame. Then, with a snarl, she turned and ran, disappearing into the darkness. I stood there for a long time, my mind a whirlwind of fear and confusion. What had just happened? And more importantly, was my wife okay? I found her a few minutes later, lying on the ground near the grave. She was unconscious, but alive. I carried her back to the church and called for help. When she woke up, she had no memory of what had happened. She was back to her normal self, as if nothing had happened. We never spoke of that night again, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed. The church, the graveyard, the light. It all felt like a bad dream, but I knew it was real. And I knew that whatever had possessed my wife that night was still out there, waiting. The church was a modest structure, nestled in the heart of our small town. Its whitewashed walls and simple wooden cross gave it an air of humility, a place where people came to find peace and solace. The pastor, a man in his late 50s with a gentle demeanor and a soft-spoken voice, was well loved by the community. He had been leading the congregation for as long as I could remember, and his sermons were always filled with wisdom and kindness. He was also my teacher, offering religious lessons to those who wanted to deepen their understanding of the faith. I had been attending his classes for a few months, and at first everything seemed normal. He was patient, knowledgeable, and genuinely cared about his students. But as time went on, I began to notice subtle changes in his behavior, changes that made me uneasy. It started with small things. During his lessons, he would occasionally drift off into long, rambling tangents that had little to do with the Bible. He would talk about ancient civilizations, lost knowledge, and the hidden meanings behind religious texts. At first, I thought it was just his way of making the lessons more engaging. But then his tone began to shift. His voice would grow low and intense, his eyes glazing over as if he were in some kind of trance. He would speak of the end times, of a great reckoning that was coming, and of the need to prepare for what lay ahead. His words were cryptic, filled with references to things I didn't understand, things that felt dark and forbidden. I tried to brush it off, telling myself that he was just passionate about his faith. But the more I listened, the more I realized that something wasn't right. His lessons began to take on a sinister undertone, as if he were trying to plant seeds of fear and doubt in our minds. He would talk about the true nature of God, about the existence of forces that most people were too blind to see. He spoke of rituals, of sacrifices, of the power that could be gained by tapping into the unknown. It was unsettling, to say the least, and I found myself growing more and more uncomfortable with each passing week. One evening, after a particularly disturbing lesson, the pastor asked me to stay behind. The other students filed out of the church, leaving me alone with him. The air felt heavy, charged with an energy I couldn't quite place. I hesitated, but I didn't want to be rude, so I agreed. We sat in the empty church, the silence pressing down on us like a heavy weight. "You're a good student," he said, his voice low and measured. "You have a curious mind, and that's a rare thing these days." I nodded, unsure of what to say. There was something in his tone that made me nervous, something that hinted at a darker intention. "I think you're ready," he continued, his eyes locking onto mine. "Ready for the truth." "The truth?" I asked, my voice trembling. "Yes," he replied, his voice rising in intensity. "The truth about this world, about the lies we've been told, the truth about God and the devil and the power that lies in between." I felt a chill run down my spine. This wasn't normal. This wasn't the kind of thing a pastor should be talking about. I wanted to leave, to get up and run out of the church, but I couldn't move. I was frozen in place, my eyes locked onto his. "You don't understand," he said, his voice growing more frantic. "You don't see what's coming. The end is near, and only those who are prepared will survive. I can prepare you. I can show you the way." I shook my head, my mind racing. I don't think I want to know," I stammered. The pastor's expression darkened, his eyes narrowing. "You don't have a choice," he said, his voice cold and menacing. "You're already part of this, whether you like it or not." Before I could react, he lunged at me, his hands grabbing my arms with a strength that surprised me. I struggled, but he was too strong. He dragged me toward the back of the church, toward a door I had never noticed before. I screamed, but no one was around to hear me. He opened the door and pushed me inside. The room was small and dark, with no windows and only a single light bulb hanging from the ceiling. The walls were covered in strange symbols, and the air was thick with the scent of incense. I realized with a sinking feeling that this was some kind of ritual room. "You'll stay here," the pastor said, his voice calm now, almost soothing, "until you understand, until you see the truth." He closed the door, and I was plunged into darkness. I screamed and pounded on the door, but it was no use. I was trapped. The hours, or maybe it was days, blurred together in that room. The darkness was suffocating, and the silence was deafening. I tried to keep my mind occupied, to think of anything other than the situation I was in, but it was impossible. The pastor's words echoed in my mind, his voice a constant reminder of the danger I was in. I didn't know what he wanted from me, but I knew it wasn't good. At some point, I must have fallen asleep because I woke up to the sound of the door creaking open. The pastor stood in the doorway, his silhouette framed by the dim light from the church. He stepped inside, closing the door behind him, and I felt a surge of panic. "Do you understand now?" he asked, his voice calm and measured. I shook my head, my voice trembling. "I don't know what you want from me." He sighed, as if disappointed. "I want you to see the truth," he said. "The truth that has been hidden from you, from everyone. The truth about the world, about the forces that control it. You have the potential to be so much more than you are, but you have to be willing to open your eyes." I didn't respond. I didn't know how to respond. His words were like a puzzle, pieces that didn't fit together, and I was too scared to try to make sense of them. The pastor knelt down in front of me, his eyes boring into mine. "You're afraid," he said. "I understand. Fear is natural, but fear is also a tool, a weapon. If you can learn to control it, to harness it, you can achieve greatness." I shook my head, tears streaming down my face. "I don't want greatness," I whispered. "I just want to go home." He smiled, a cold, calculating smile. "Home is an illusion," he said. "There is no home, not in the way you think. The only home you have is the one you create for yourself, and I can help you create it." Before I could say anything else, he reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, ornate knife. My heart skipped a beat, and I scrambled backward, but there was nowhere to go. The walls of the room closed in around me, and I felt like I was suffocating. "Don't be afraid," he said, his voice soothing now, almost gentle. "This is just the beginning, the first step on your journey." He raised the knife, and I closed my eyes, bracing myself for the worst. But before he could do anything, there was a loud banging on the church doors. The pastor froze, his eyes widening in fear. He stood up quickly, his face pale, and turned toward the door. "Stay here," he said, his voice trembling. "Don't move." He left the room, closing the door behind him, and I was plunged back into darkness. I didn't know what was happening, but I knew I had to get out of there. I crawled toward the door, my hands trembling as I felt for the handle. It was locked, but I could hear voices on the other side, voices that didn't belong to the pastor. A few moments later, the door burst open, and I saw a group of police officers standing there. They had received an anonymous tip about the pastor's behavior, and they had come to investigate. They found me in the ritual room, and they arrested the pastor on the spot. The days that followed were a blur. I was questioned by the police, and I told them everything I could remember. They searched the church and found more evidence of the pastor's dark activities, books on occult practices, strange artifacts, and even more ritual rooms hidden throughout the building. It was clear that he had been involved in something far more sinister than anyone had realized. The pastor was charged with multiple crimes, including kidnapping and attempted assault. He's in jail now, awaiting trial, and I doubt he'll ever see the light of day again. As for me, I've tried to move on, but the experience has left a mark on me that I don't think will ever fully heal. The church is still there, a modest structure nestled in the heart of our small town, but I'll never look at it the same way again. It's a reminder of the darkness that can lurk behind even the most innocent facades, and of the importance of staying vigilant, even in the places where we feel the safest.